Shadows beneath the badge. The humid heat of the city swirled with the aroma of street vendors and the faint metallic tang of rain that hadn't yet arrived. On a quiet street, the sound of shuffling papers mixed with muffled voices echoed through the city courthouse. Inside, Amara Elwood, sharp-suited, determined, and poised, wrapped up yet another case. The courtroom had just adjourned, and her client, a young single mother fighting for custody of her child, turned to her with tearful eyes. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and gratitude. Amara gave a small, reassuring smile. "We don't stop fighting until the system works for everyone," she said, gripping the woman's hand briefly before walking away. As she descended the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed with notifications. Messages from community leaders, activists, and organizers flooded in. Amara had been balancing a delicate double life. Attorney General by title, advocate for systemic reform by conviction. She knew her work in the shadows would make waves, but she underestimated the storm it would unleash. She paused on the sidewalk, scrolling through messages. Among them was a forwarded post from social media, accompanied by a terse note from her assistant. "Officer Merrick Prescott is at it again. Public incident. Bad optics. You'll want to see this." Clicking the video, Amara's breath caught. The footage was shaky, but clear enough. A black woman, visibly distressed, being aggressively detained by a police officer on a dimly lit street. The officer was Prescott, a name that had become synonymous with unchecked power. His words were harsh, his posture aggressive as he pushed the woman toward the squad car. Onlookers yelled protests, their voices rising in pitch, but Prescott remained unfazed. "What's he doing?" Amara muttered to herself, her chest tightening. This wasn't just another arrest. It was a display, a warning, and an open challenge. The incident. By the time Amara arrived at the community center for her scheduled forum on law enforcement accountability, the energy in the room was electric. Attendees filled the folding chairs, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: hope, skepticism, anger, and exhaustion. Posters lined the walls, calling for justice and reform. At the back of the room stood a cluster of uniformed officers, their presence more intimidating than protective. Taking the stage, Amara adjusted the microphone, her movements deliberate and calm. She could feel the weight of their stares, especially from the officers. Prescott wasn't among them, but his shadow loomed over the gathering like a specter. "When we talk about reform," Amara began, her voice clear and steady, "we're not attacking individuals. We're addressing a system that has failed too many of us. Accountability isn't an attack, it's a necessity." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She spotted familiar faces, mothers who'd lost sons to police violence, young men with stories of wrongful detainment, and local activists whose passion fueled grassroots change. But her words were also met with folded arms and skeptical gazes from the officers in the back. Among them, Lieutenant Briggs exchanged a glance with his colleagues, his expression unreadable. After the forum, as the crowd dispersed, Amara stayed behind, fielding questions and offering reassurances to those emboldened by her speech. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as she walked home, the heat giving way to a faint chill. The confrontation. It was around the corner from her street when the unmistakable voice rang out. "Excuse me, Mom," a sharp, sarcastic tone called. Amara turned, her heart sinking. Officer Merrick Prescott stepped out of his patrol car, his hand casually resting near his holster. His uniform was pristine, but his smirk betrayed his disdain. "Jaywalking, huh?" he said mockingly, his eyes narrowing as he approached her. Amara glanced at the empty street and frowned. "Officer Prescott, it's a quiet road, hardly a risk to public safety." "Breaking the law is breaking the law," Prescott replied, stepping closer. The way he stood, towering and imposing, made her stomach churn. "You think standing on a podium makes you untouchable," he continued, his voice dripping with derision. "Think again." "Officer Prescott," Amara said, her tone calm but firm. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just walking home." "Trouble?" Prescott scoffed, his smirk deepening. "You're the one causing trouble, stirring up the community, spreading lies. People like you make my job harder." Around them, passers-by stopped to watch, their curiosity quickly turning into concern. A few raised their phones, capturing the interaction. Amara's every nerve screamed caution, but she refused to back down. "This is unnecessary," she said, her hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. "Let me pass." Prescott's smirk twisted into something darker. Without warning, he grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. Gasps erupted from the growing crowd, their shock audible. "This is harassment," someone shouted. Amara winced, her voice steady despite the pain. "What are you proving here, Officer Prescott?" "You're under arrest," he declared, his tone as cold as the cuffs he fastened around her wrists. "Interfering with public order." The aftermath. Inside the squad car, Amara sat in silence, her mind racing. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. This wasn't just an arrest, it was an attack on everything she stood for. As the car rumbled toward the station, she replayed the scene in her mind, cataloging every detail. When they arrived at the station, the air was heavy with fluorescent light and tension. Officers glanced at her briefly before returning to their tasks, their expressions unreadable. Prescott guided her to the booking desk with unnecessary force, his smugness radiating. "Name," the officer at the desk said without looking up. "Amara Elwood," she replied, her voice calm but firm. The booking officer froze mid-motion, her eyes flicking up to meet Amara's. A flicker of recognition passed over her face before she quickly masked it. Prescott, however, was oblivious, chuckling as he muttered, "Community hero." As the booking process unfolded, Amara's mind churned. She knew she couldn't let this moment define her, but it would. The crowd's videos would surface, the story would spread, and the fight for justice would grow fiercer. She was prepared for that. What she wasn't prepared for was the way Prescott's colleagues looked at her as they led her to a holding cell. It wasn't curiosity or even contempt, it was fear. They didn't just recognize her. They knew who she was. And they knew Prescott had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The unraveling begins. The cold steel of the holding cell pressed against Amara Elwood's back as she leaned against the wall. Her mind was a storm, emotions clashing violently beneath her calm exterior. The dim, flickering light overhead cast shadows that danced across the gray concrete walls. The weight of her arrest wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It represented every individual who'd ever been silenced, cuffed, or dismissed by a broken system. Across the hall, the low hum of conversation filtered in from the station. Occasionally, Amara caught snippets of words from the officers. Reckless, activist, and what the hell was Prescott thinking? Their tones were hushed, uncertain. She smirked grimly. They didn't yet realize how much worse things were about to get. She wasn't just anyone. They had arrested the Attorney General. The tension mounts. Officer Merrick Prescott leaned against the station counter, his confidence slightly rattled but his bravado intact. He didn't need to think much about what he'd done. It was routine for him. Anyone who challenged his authority deserved to be put in their place, and this woman was no different. Or so he thought. Lieutenant Briggs approached, his brow furrowed. "What's this I'm hearing about your latest arrest, Prescott?" Prescott smirked. Another loudmouth trying to disrupt public order. "Made a show of it on the street. I shut it down." Briggs crossed his arms. "You're telling me you dragged someone into the station for jaywalking?" "Interfering with public order," Prescott corrected, his tone defensive. "Do you even know who she is?" Briggs's voice dropped lower, his eyes narrowing. "She's one of those community agitators," Prescott said, brushing it off. "Thinks she can talk her way out of accountability." Briggs leaned closer, his voice cold. "She's not just a community leader. She's the state's Attorney General." The smirk froze on Prescott's face. He blinked, the weight of the revelation slamming into him like a truck. "You're lying." Briggs didn't flinch. "I suggest you think about how you're going to handle this, because if she decides to come after you, you're not just facing a slap on the wrist. This could take down your whole career." Flora's investigation. Across town, journalist Flora Callan sat at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The video of Amara's arrest had already gone viral, and Flora had spent the last 3 hours dissecting every second of it. She knew there was more to the story than what was visible on the surface. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. It was a message from one of her confidential sources within the department. "Prescott screwed up. Big time. He doesn't know who he arrested. She's not just another activist. You need to follow this." Flora's eyes widened as she reread the text. She already suspected there was more to Amara than met the eye. But this confirmed it. Her instincts fired on all cylinders. Prescott wasn't just dealing with an ordinary citizen. He'd picked a fight with someone who had the power to dismantle him and everything he stood for. The crowd outside. Outside the police station, a crowd had gathered, their signs and chants piercing through the cold night air. The news of the arrest spread like wildfire, igniting a movement that had been simmering for weeks. Protesters called for justice, their voices echoing into the night. "Let her go," someone shouted, their words punctuated by the rhythmic stomping of feet. Others held signs with messages like "Justice for all" and "End police abuse." The air was thick with tension, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Amid the crowd, local activist Maria Alvarez moved from group to group, organizing chants and ensuring things stayed peaceful. She spotted a few unfamiliar faces, agitators who looked more interested in stirring chaos than supporting the cause. "Keep it calm," she urged the crowd, her voice steady. "We're here to make a statement, not give them an excuse." Inside the cell, Amara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She glanced up to see a young officer standing outside her cell, his face pale. He hesitated before unlocking the door and motioning her to follow. "You've got a visitor," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Amara stood, smoothing her suit as best she could. Her composure was unshaken, even as her heart raced with anticipation. She was escorted to a small, sterile interview room where Flora Callan was waiting, her notepad open and pen poised. "Flora," Amara greeted her, sitting across the table. "Attorney General Elwood," Flora replied, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "I had my suspicions about you, but you're a hard woman to track down." Amara smirked faintly. "I prefer my work to speak for itself." "Well, it's about to get a lot louder," Flora said, leaning forward. "The video of your arrest is everywhere. People are asking questions, and I've been digging. Prescott doesn't just have skeletons in his closet. He has a whole graveyard. And now you're in the perfect position to bring it all down." Amara's expression hardened. "What have you found?" Flora slid a folder across the table. Inside were records, emails, and reports detailing years of misconduct tied to Prescott. False arrests, fabricated charges, and financial kickbacks. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Flora said. "He's part of something bigger. There's a network protecting him, and it goes higher than you think." Amara flipped through the pages, her jaw tightening with every new piece of evidence. She'd suspected corruption, but this was far more extensive than she'd imagined. "This could expose everything," Amara murmured, more to herself than to Flora. Flora nodded. "It could, but you'll need to decide how to play it. If you reveal your identity, you'll have the platform to take this all the way. But the backlash will be brutal." Amara leaned back, her mind racing. She had spent years working in the shadows, quietly dismantling systemic corruption. But now, the shadows were no longer an option. Prescott's panic. In another corner of the city, Prescott sat in a dimly lit bar, nursing a drink and scrolling through his phone. The viral video of the arrest played on a loop, and every headline seemed to scream his impending downfall. His colleagues had started to distance themselves, their loyalty evaporating in the face of public scrutiny. "You've got to get ahead of this," his confident urged from across the table. "If she's who they say she is, this isn't just bad optics, it's career-ending." Prescott's face darkened. "She's not going to win. Not on my watch." He took another sip, his mind racing with ways to discredit her, to turn the narrative against her before it was too late. A choice to make. As the night wore on, Amara sat alone in the holding cell, Flora's words replaying in her mind. She was at a crossroads. Revealing her identity would bring both power and peril. She could no longer remain hidden, but stepping into the light meant becoming a target. Her phone, returned to her for the night, buzzed with a message from Maria. "The crowd outside is growing. They're waiting for you. We're waiting for you." Amara stared at the screen, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Tomorrow, she knew, everything would change. Whether she chose to reveal her identity or not, the fight was just beginning. And she was ready. The turning tide. The dawn broke with muted sunlight, casting long shadows over the police station where Amara Elwood remained in custody. The protests outside had swelled overnight, spilling into the streets with renewed vigor. Chants of "justice for all" echoed against the concrete walls, their rhythmic pulse a testament to the growing movement. Inside, Amara sat in the sterile confines of the station's interview room, her hands resting on the table. Across from her was Maria Alvarez, who had been granted special access under the pretense of calming the crowd. Maria leaned forward, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Amara, the crowd's getting restless. They're demanding answers, and your silence is feeding Prescott's narrative." Amara's jaw tightened. "If I make a statement now, it'll be reactive. Prescott wants me to act on his timeline. I need to control the narrative." Maria sighed, her eyes scanning the room. "Then you need to decide soon. The people outside, your people, need a leader." Amara met her gaze, the weight of Maria's words sinking in. She had spent years fighting the system from the shadows, but now the spotlight was unavoidable. The movement she had helped build was reaching a critical moment, and she couldn't afford hesitation. Prescott's desperation. Across town, Officer Merrick Prescott paced the dimly lit conference room in the precinct. His normally polished demeanor was frayed, his movements erratic. The department's PR officer, a composed woman named Janine, sat at the end of the table, her arms crossed. "We need to get ahead of this," Prescott growled, slamming his fist on the table. "That crowd out there is making us look weak." Janine arched an eyebrow. "Weak? They're making you look incompetent. There's a difference." Prescott's glare darkened. "Whose side are you on?" "Prescott," she said, leaning forward, "this isn't just about you anymore. Do you know how much heat the department is taking because of your little stunt? And now we're hearing rumors about who she really is." His face paled. "Rumors?" Janine smirked. "Oh, you didn't know. That woman you arrested, she's the Attorney General." The room fell silent. Prescott's fists clenched at his sides. "If that's true, she's been lying to everyone, pretending to be one of them while holding the power to fix this system herself. Or," Janine countered, "she's been working to fix it without drawing attention until you forced her hand." Prescott stormed out, his mind racing. He needed a plan, and he needed it now. A smear campaign wouldn't be enough. He needed something stronger, something that would make Amara crumble before she could strike. The press conference. By mid-morning, the protest had drawn the attention of national media. Vans with satellite dishes lined the streets, and reporters jockeyed for position outside the station. Inside, Amara prepared herself for what was about to come. Maria returned, handing her a clean blouse and blazer. "They're letting you out." Prescott's trying to minimize the PR disaster. Amara nodded, her face calm, but her heart pounding. "Good, let them think they're in control." As she stepped out of the station, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Cameras flashed, capturing her every move. Amara raised a hand, acknowledging the crowd, but didn't stop to speak. Instead, she headed straight for the makeshift podium set up on the corner. She took the microphone, her voice steady but commanding. "Thank you for standing with me," she began, her words cutting through the noise. Yesterday was not just about one person being detained. It was about a system that continues to fail the people it is meant to serve. The crowd roared in agreement, their chants of justice growing louder. Amara continued, her tone unwavering. "Many of you may not know this, but my fight for reform has been more personal than you realize. I have spent years working within the system, using every tool at my disposal to challenge its failures. But yesterday I was reminded that the system does not respond to quiet advocacy. It responds to power and to people demanding change." She paused, letting her words sink in. "It's time I stop working from the shadows. My name is Amara Elwood, and I am the Attorney General of this state." The crowd erupted, their cheers deafening. Amara stood firm, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. Some looked shocked, others inspired, but all were united in their attention. "From this moment on," she said, her voice rising, "we are not just fighting for accountability. We are fighting for transformation." The fallout. The press conference sent shockwaves across the state and beyond. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, their headlines dominated by the dual revelations of Amara's identity and her arrest. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeWithAmara and #PrescottExposed. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Prescott's phone buzzed incessantly. His allies were abandoning him, their loyalty wavering in the face of mounting public pressure. "Lieutenant Briggs is going to open an internal review," one of his confidants said over the phone. "You're losing your footing, Merrick. You need to get out ahead of this." Prescott snarled. "This isn't over. She wants a fight. She's going to get one." He hung up, his mind racing. Amara had forced his hand, but he wasn't about to go down without taking her with him. The whistleblower. Later that evening, Flora Callan received an encrypted email from an anonymous source within the department. The subject line read, "Prescott's Playbook." Flora's heart raced as she opened the file. Inside were documents detailing not only Prescott's history of misconduct, but also connections to higher-ranking officials. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had suspected. She immediately called Amara. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly. "It's not just Prescott. This implicates people at the state level, judges, commissioners, even lawmakers. They've been protecting him for years." Amara's voice was steady but cold. "Then we expose them all." The movement gains momentum. As night fell, the streets of the city were alive with the glow of candles and the sound of chants. The movement had grown beyond Amara, beyond the police station. It was now a statewide call for justice. Amara stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as people of all backgrounds came together. Maria joined her, holding a sign that read, "Accountability now." "This is what it looks like," Maria said, her voice filled with pride. Amara nodded. "This is just the beginning." As the chants rose into the night, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight ahead would be grueling, and the forces aligned against her were powerful. But for the first time, she felt the tide turning. The system had underestimated her. Now it would face the full force of a united people, breaking the chains. The night sky over Asheville was alive with voices. Thousands had gathered in solidarity, their chants reverberating off the tall buildings lining the city square. The protest, sparked by Amara's arrest and fueled by her revelation as the state's attorney general, had become something larger, a declaration of defiance against systemic oppression. At the center of it all, Amara Elwood stood on the makeshift stage, flanked by Maria Alvarez and other community leaders. Candles lit up the crowd, their warm glow reflected in the determined faces of those who had come from every corner of the state to be part of this moment. Amara raised her hands, calling for quiet. The sea of voices hushed almost instantly. Her heart pounded as she stepped to the microphone, aware that every word would be dissected by both allies and enemies. Cameras from local and national outlets framed her, broadcasting the moment live. "We are standing on the edge of a reckoning," she began, her voice steady but commanding. "For years, this system has operated in the shadows, perpetuating injustice while silencing those who dare to challenge it. But no more." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound like a wave crashing against the steps of City Hall. "Let me be clear," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "This is not just about one officer. It's about the culture that allows men like Merrick Prescott to thrive. It's about the policies, the enablers, and the complacency that have left too many of us marginalized, forgotten, and afraid." Her words ignited the crowd again, but she held up a hand to temper their energy. "We are here to demand accountability," she said, her voice rising. "Not just for one man, but for an entire system. And I promise you, as your Attorney General, I will use every tool at my disposal to dismantle the structures that uphold this corruption." Prescott's counterstrike. In a dimly lit office across town, Merrick Prescott sat hunched over his desk, his expression dark. The noise from the protest drifted faintly through the open window, a haunting reminder of the movement growing beyond his control. Across from him sat a figure shrouded in shadows, an influential ally whose resources Prescott had come to rely on. The man leaned back in his chair, exuding calm confidence. "You're losing the public," the man said, his voice smooth but cutting. "This isn't just bad optics, it's a collapse." Prescott clenched his fists. "I've handled worse. Elwood's playing a dangerous game. She's got skeletons of her own, and I intend to dig them out." The man smirked faintly. "Be careful, Prescott. If you swing and miss, it'll be your head on the chopping block. And you're not just risking your career, you're risking mine." "I won't miss," Prescott snapped. "She wants to take me down. Fine. I'll remind everyone she's not as clean as she pretends to be." The man leaned forward, his face now partially illuminated. "Then you'd better move fast." The whistleblower's warning. Later that night, Flora Callan was in her small, cluttered apartment, her laptop screen glowing with files from her latest lead. She had spent the past 48 hours connecting the dots. Prescott's actions weren't isolated. The evidence pointed to a network of power that reached into the upper echelons of the state government. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her anonymous source. "We need to meet. Now. They're covering their tracks faster than expected. This is bigger than we thought." Flora's pulse quickened. She replied immediately. "Where?" A single word came back. "Bridgepoint." Flora grabbed her coat and notepad, the weight of what she was about to uncover pressing on her chest. The protest turns. Back at the rally, the atmosphere was electric. The crowd swayed between chants, their energy palpable. Amara had stepped down from the stage, but remained at the center of attention, speaking with community members and reporters alike. Maria approached, her phone in hand. "You need to see this," she said, her tone urgent. Amara looked at the screen, her stomach nodding, as she read the headline. "Exclusive. Allegations against Attorney General Elwood Surface." The article was riddled with half-truths and outright lies, painting Amara as a hypocrite who had abused her position to shield corrupt allies. The timing was deliberate, a calculated strike meant to discredit her. Maria's voice softened. "Prescott's not just fighting for his career anymore. He's trying to destroy you." Amara squared her shoulders. "Let him try." The whistleblower's reveal. At Bridgepoint, a small cafe tucked away in the outskirts of the city, Flora met with her source, a young officer whose nervous glances betrayed the risk he was taking. "They're shredding files," he said, sliding the USB drive across the table. "Emails, memos, everything that ties Prescott to the higher-ups. But I managed to pull this before it was destroyed." Flora plugged the drive into her laptop, her breath catching as the files loaded. The contents were damning. Financial records showing bribes, communication logs detailing coordinated cover-ups, and direct orders from senior officials to quash investigations. This, she began, her voice trailing off. It's enough to burn them all, the officer said. But you need to move fast. They'll come for you next. Amara's plan. The next morning, Amara convened an emergency meeting with Maria and her legal team. The room buzzed with tension as Flora arrived, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. "This is it," Flora said, plugging the drive into the room's projector. The files illuminated the screen, each one more damning than the last. Amara scanned the documents, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "We take this public." Maria hesitated. "Are you sure? This isn't just Prescott. This is an entire network of powerful people. They won't go down quietly." Amara's gaze hardened. "They've had their time in the shadows. Now it's our turn to shine a light." The public bombshell. By noon, Amara held a press conference outside the courthouse. The crowd had doubled in size, and the media swarmed like bees to honey. "Today," Amara began, holding up a folder of documents, "we take a stand against corruption. The files you are about to see are not just about one officer or one department. They expose a network of systemic abuse, spanning multiple agencies and implicating some of the most powerful figures in this state." She handed the folder to a journalist in the front row, the cameras capturing every second. "This is just the beginning. To everyone who has fought for justice, this is your victory. To those who have enabled this corruption, your time is up." The crowd erupted, their chants shaking the very ground beneath them. But as Amara stepped away from the podium, her phone buzzed with a new message. "You've declared war. We won't go quietly." Amara stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't backing down. Into the abyss. The courthouse steps were quiet in the early morning light, but the silence belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. Inside, Amara Elwood paced the halls of her office, her thoughts racing. The press conference had sent shockwaves through the state. Headlines blared across every major news outlet. "Elwood unleashes corruption bombshell," and "Power Network exposed." Fallout begins. The files Flora Callan had unearthed were now public, their damning contents igniting a firestorm of outrage and debate. Public officials scrambled to issue statements, distancing themselves from the fallout. But for every voice of support, there was an equally loud cry of dissent. Amara sat at her desk, scrolling through her phone. Social media was a battleground. Hashtags like #JusticeWithAmara trended alongside #ElwoodExposed as Prescott's allies waged a coordinated counteroffensive. Her phone buzzed with a call from Maria Alvarez. "They're moving fast," Maria said, her voice sharp with urgency. "Prescott's doubling down. He's holding a press conference this afternoon, and you can bet he's going to twist this into an attack against you." Amara leaned back, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Let him. The evidence is out there. He can't bury the truth." "He doesn't have to bury it," Maria countered. "He just has to muddy the waters enough to make people doubt you." Amara closed her eyes briefly, then straightened. "Then we fight harder." Prescott's gambit. At the police department's headquarters, Merrick Prescott stood before a cluster of reporters, flanked by a handful of loyal officers. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm raging within. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured, "I want to address the baseless accusations that have been levied against me and the brave men and women of this department." He held up a stack of papers, his movements deliberate. "What Amara Elwood and her so-called allies have presented to the public is nothing more than a coordinated smear campaign designed to destabilize law enforcement. The documents released lack context, and many are outright fabrications." A reporter raised her hand. "Officer Prescott, what about the financial records linking you to bribery?" Prescott's jaw tightened, but he didn't falter. "Those records are cherry-picked. Taken out of context, they paint a false narrative. This is nothing more than a political stunt by an attorney general desperate to cover her own failures. Another voice called out, "Are you saying Attorney General Elwood is lying?" Prescott's lips curled into a smirk. "I'm saying she's playing a dangerous game. And when the dust settles, the truth will be clear." The movement splinters. As the day wore on, the impact of Prescott's words began to ripple. While many stood firmly behind Amara, cracks in the movement began to show. In smaller communities, fears of law enforcement retaliation grew. Business owners expressed concern about the economic fallout of ongoing protests, and in some activist circles, there was quiet dissent. Flora Callan was the first to notice the shift. At a meeting of local organizers that evening, she overheard hushed conversations. "She should have waited," one man muttered, his arms crossed. "Dropping all that without a plan. It's reckless." Another woman nodded. "I'm all for reform, but this feels like a power grab. Prescott's not the only problem, and she knows it." Flora stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "If you think this is reckless, you're not paying attention. Amara put herself on the line for this movement. She didn't have to. She chose to because it's the right thing to do." The group quieted, but the tension lingered. Flora knew the fractures were small now, but if left unchecked, they could grow into chasms. A warning in the night. That night, Amara returned to her apartment under the watchful eye of two plainclothes officers assigned to her protection detail. Her steps were heavy as she climbed the stairs, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Inside, the apartment was dark and silent. She set her bag on the table and poured herself a glass of water, her mind racing with the events of the day. But as she turned to head to her bedroom, she froze. On the kitchen counter was an envelope. It hadn't been there when she left. Her pulse quickened as she approached it, her hand trembling slightly. She opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The words were typed, cold and clinical. "You've made your move. Now it's our turn. Stop, or the next target won't be you. It'll be someone you care about." Her chest tightened. She scanned the room, her heart pounding, then grabbed her phone to call the detail stationed outside. Within moments, the officers were inside, sweeping the apartment. "Everything's secure," one of them said after a thorough search. No sign of forced entry. Amara stared at the note, her mind racing. Whoever had left it wasn't just threatening her. They were sending a message. Flora's discovery. Meanwhile, in her office, Flora was combing through the files on the USB drive again, searching for anything she might have missed. The connections she had already uncovered were damning, but she felt there was more buried within the data. Then she found it. A series of emails between a state commissioner and a private contractor revealed a covert surveillance operation. The target, Amara Elwood. The emails detailed efforts to monitor her movements, track her communications, and discredit her publicly. Flora's blood ran cold. This wasn't just retaliation. It was a coordinated attack. She immediately called Amara. "You're being watched," she said, her voice urgent. "There's a surveillance operation targeting you. They'd been following you for weeks." Amara's silence was heavy. "Finally," she said, "send me everything you have." The war room. The following morning, Amara convened her team in a secure location, a borrowed conference room in a law firm sympathetic to their cause. Maria, Flora, and a handful of trusted allies sat around the table, the tension palpable. Flora presented her findings, her voice steady but grave. "This isn't just Prescott. It's a coalition. State officials, private contractors, even members of the judiciary. They're working together to protect their interests, and they see you as the biggest threat." Amara's eyes narrowed. "Then we make them regret underestimating me." Maria leaned forward. "We need a plan. Something big, something they can't ignore." Amara nodded, her mind already racing. "We'll hit them where it hurts, their credibility. Flora, you keep digging. Find me the smoking gun. Maria, rally the organizers. We need every voice we can get. And you, Flora asked. Amara's gaze was steely. I'll go straight to the people. A voice for justice. That evening, Amara appeared on a nationally televised town hall. The stage was stark, the lighting dramatic, and the audience a mix of supporters, skeptics, and critics. I didn't choose this fight, she began, her voice steady but impassioned. But I won't run from it. What we're facing isn't just about corruption in one department or one city. It's about a system that has failed us all. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. I know there are those who doubt me, she continued, who question my motives, my actions. But I ask you this, what would you do if you had the chance to change the world? Would you hesitate? Or would you act, knowing the risks? The audience was silent, captivated. Amara leaned forward, her voice lowering. We can no longer wait for change to come. We must demand it. And I promise you, I will not stop until justice is served. The applause was thunderous, drowning out even the faintest whisper of dissent. But as Amara left the stage, her phone buzzed with another message. You think you've won tonight, but this is far from over. Amara stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. The battle was intensifying, and the enemy was growing more desperate. But so was she. The reckoning. The city was a cauldron of unrest by the time the clock struck noon. The crowds outside the Capitol building had swelled to the thousands, spilling into the adjacent streets. Signs and banners waved in a sea of defiance, their slogans bold and uncompromising. Justice for all. Expose the corruption, and no more lies. From her vantage point, inside a secure conference room, Amara Elwood could hear the chants faintly, their rhythm like a war drum pounding in her chest. The culmination of weeks of turmoil, sacrifice, and resilience had led to this moment. But as she stared at the stacks of documents and laptops spread across the table, the weight of the impending confrontation threatened to crush her. Maria Alvarez stood beside her, arms crossed. The people are ready. They're here for you, Amara. For all of us. Flora Callan sat at the other end of the table, her laptop open, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I just received another email from the whistleblower, she announced. More details about the surveillance operation. They'd been tracking not just you, but several organizers. They've even been infiltrating the protests. Amara's expression darkened. They think they can intimidate us into silence. Flora looked up, her face grim. It's worse than that. They're planning something bigger. Discrediting you wasn't enough. They want to sow chaos at today's rally. Prescott's last move. Meanwhile, in a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city, Merrick Prescott sat with his remaining allies, a collection of bureaucrats, contractors, and political operatives whose fear now outstripped their loyalty. We can't hold the line much longer, one of them said, his voice trembling. The public is turning against us. The evidence is too damning. Prescott slammed his fist on the table. The evidence is circumstantial. It's a media circus, and she's leading it. This isn't about justice. It's a power grab. Another voice, calmer but no less urgent, interjected. Merrick, we have to face reality. The longer this drags on, the more likely we all fall. She's not just exposing you. She's exposing the system. Prescott's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing. Then we remind her what happens when you challenge the system. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Deploy the agitators. If the rally turns violent, she'll lose her credibility. The public will blame her for the chaos. His allies exchanged uneasy glances, but no one objected. The plan was set. The rally erupts. By mid-afternoon, the rally was in full swing. The square in front of the Capitol was packed, the energy electric. Speakers took the stage one by one, their voices amplified across the crowd. Amara stood backstage, watching as Maria addressed the audience with fiery passion. This is not just a moment, Maria declared. This is a movement to dismantle the systems that have oppressed us for generations. The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers echoing across the city. But as Amara stepped forward, ready to take the microphone, Flora appeared beside her, her face pale. "They're here," Flora said, her voice low but urgent. "The agitators Prescott sent. They've already started. There's a group near the west entrance inciting fights. Another group's pushing into the barricades." Amara's stomach sank, but she nodded. "We can't let them derail this." She stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding immediate silence. The crowd quieted, their attention fixed on her. "We are here today," she began, her voice steady, "not as enemies of the system, but as champions of justice. Our fight is not against individuals, but against corruption, against a system that has failed too many for too long." The crowd cheered, but the noise from the west side grew louder. Shouts and the sound of scuffling reached the stage. Amara raised her hand, calming the audience. "They want us to lose control," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "They want us to become what they fear most, but we will not give them that satisfaction. We will stand together, peacefully, powerfully, united." The truth unveiled. As Amara spoke, Flora worked feverishly behind the scenes. Using the files from the whistleblower, she compiled a comprehensive report on Prescott's plans, including the deployment of agitators. She sent the report to every major news outlet, attaching video evidence captured by protesters and undercover activists. Within minutes, headlines began to break. Leaked documents reveal plot to undermine rally. Prescott linked to protest agitation scheme. Corruption network faces national scrutiny. The news spread like wildfire, and the crowd's mood shifted. Protesters began isolating the agitators, identifying them, and turning them over to the authorities. The tide was turning, and Prescott's last gambit was unraveling in real time. Prescott's fall. Back in his office, Prescott stared at the television screen, his face pale as the headlines scrolled across the bottom. "This isn't happening," he muttered, his voice hollow. "They can't prove anything." One of his allies stood abruptly, shaking his head. "It's over, Merrick. I'm not going down with you." One by one, the others left, their silence louder than any condemnation. Prescott sat alone, the weight of his choices crushing him. Victory on the steps. As the sun set over the Capitol, the rally reached its climax. Amara stood at the podium, her voice carrying over the sea of people. "This is not the end," she said. "This is the beginning. Today, we have shown that no amount of intimidation, no amount of corruption, can silence a united people. Together, we will rebuild this system. Together, we will ensure that justice is not just a promise, but a reality." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, their cheers ringing out across the city. The aftermath. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and far-reaching. Prescott was arrested, facing charges of corruption, conspiracy, and abuse of power. Several high-ranking officials were implicated in the scandal, their resignations dominating the news. Amara became a national figure, her fight for justice inspiring movements across the country. But she remained grounded, refusing to let the spotlight distract her from the work ahead. In her office, Maria and Flora joined her for a quiet moment of reflection. "We did it," Maria said, her voice filled with pride. Amara nodded, but her gaze was distant. "We've started something. But the work isn't over." Flora smiled. "It never is." Amara leaned back in her chair, the weight of the journey settling on her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small smile. The battle had been won, but the war for justice was just beginning.